Hello everyone. Can we confirm if okay? Um, Welcome everyone to the global session on loss and damage, which is operationalizing loss and damage. This is going to be a very informative session. We have a great line of speakers for this event. And before we start with the speakers, let me show a couple of slides just to get everyone on the same page and understanding on what loss and damage is and what this session is going to be about. So you can understand loss and damage as the third pillar alongside mitigation and adaptation. So while we try to avert climate impacts in mitigation actions, we try to minimize impacts in adaptation actions. In loss and damage, we try to directly address these impacts. So any actions that or activities or project that deals with addressing residual impacts that are irreversible or preparing to address them effectively can be categorized as loss and damage. This is the general understanding of loss and damage in the discussion at the UNFCCC level. Now it's a very new field. There are a lot of uncertainty as to how to deal effectively with loss and damage, and rightly so. The discussion around loss and damage very often is evolved around the new fund. It's about the funding that is available. We heard a couple of sessions yesterday about how this new fund has been set up, but loss and damage is more than just financing or the new fund. There needs to be systems in place, understanding, ability to use the fund effectively to address the climate impacts. We hear about direct access to communities, for example, but just because there is a new pot of funding being made available to communities, it doesn't mean that it can translate into effective implementation. It is only fair and our responsibility to make sure that there are the communities are equipped with information, tools, systems, infrastructure in place to address the impacts. If it's about accessing the fund, is there any bank account available to a vulnerable community affected by the impacts? Is it going to be cash transfer, mobile transfer? Do they have to apply for the funding electronically? So there's a lot of things that needs to be put in place, but luckily, countries don't have to figure things out on their own. The UNFCCC has a great framework, mechanism in place to actually support the country in terms of policy, technical assistance, as well as financial assistance in terms of the funding, to make sure that they're able to get the support that is needed so that later on they're able to access the fund and transform them into projects, programs, activities. And this will be the core of this session today, is to actually share these information on what is out there, the governance structure from the UNFCCC, so that countries are able to utilize them, take advantage of them, and get the support that is needed. So we have 4 speakers. I will introduce each of them as we go with the agenda. But I would like to say that some of these speakers are at the very forefront of decision making on how loss and damage should evolve over the years. There are some board members of the fund, people who are actually, Natalie, for example, doing work on the ground. We have Chris from Vanuatu, who is one of the most advanced country in terms of L&D. So I invite everyone to be very active in the Q&A session that we have planned later to ask questions, because these people are the primary source of information when it comes to loss and damage. So I would then like to move on to the first speaker, who is Mr. Hafiz Khan. He is an executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, or known as the XCOM to the WIM. And Mr. Hafiz Khan is an environmental lawyer and is also leading the Center for Climate Justice in Bangladesh and has been involved in loss and damage negotiations since 2001. He's also involved in the works of the LBC group and is a prominent figure in LND, and he will be introducing the role of XCOM WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, in loss and damage. Mr. Hafiz, over to you.
Thank you, Shivanis, for your warm introduction and also excellent overview on the loss and damage. That is really helpful for me to explain this infograph, particularly focused on the global governance on loss and damage. So, Shivanis, you talked about the mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. These are the now three streams, policy streams. And we always we say that mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage is a continuum. Particularly mitigation and adaptation, we think that's the ex-ante or proactive action to reduce the potential risk of loss and damage. And loss and damage, it means very simple loss and damage that needs to be addressed. Even there are some sensitivity in our climate diplomacy, that is loss and damage does not include the liability and compensation regime. So that is not the case now for me to talk about. Basically, I would like to see the current governance structure under the United Nations Framework Convention. So under the convention, colleagues, you know that we established the Warsaw International Mechanism back in 2013. And this international mechanism later adopted an executive committee, 20 members in 2014, and currently I'm one of the members of this executive committee. So basically, executive committee was formed to deliver the key functions of the Warsaw International Mechanism. This executive committee now is 10 years and implementing third rolling work plan. So interestingly, executive committee at this moment developing some technical guides. As Shivanis, you talked about addressing the impacts. However, before addressing the impacts, we need to assess the nature of loss and damage. We need to assess the community needs, including financial needs. So this sort of need assessment require some sort of tools and methodologies. Interestingly, now the executive committee, in collaboration with its expert groups, you know that 5 expert groups are working very closely with the 20 members executive committee. So now question is, once the executive committee is producing these sort of tools and methodologies, and who gonna utilize this? Who are the target audience? Of course, that is the national governments. They need to utilize these tools and methodologies. But challenge is, once we're trying to develop a globally standard tools and methodologies, those needs to be translated, taking into account the national circumstances. That's a big challenge. And who's going to address this challenge? That's very simple. That is the Santiago Network that was established back in 2019 at COP25. Basically, this Santiago Network we established with a view to catalyze the technical assistance to the vulnerable developing countries. So this Santiago Network now to be operationalized in this year. And we all know that it is hosted by the UNEPs and UNDRI jointly. Now Secretariat is based in Geneva, and an advisory board already met 3 times in this year. They are now developing their own rules of procedure. Also, they are developing their plan of action. Also they are trying to identify the modalities for selecting OBNs, that is organization expert or networks. So at this moment, you see under Warsaw International Mechanism, there are two constituted bodies are working parallelly. That is Executive Committee. That's a constituted body under the convention. Also, the Advisory Board for the Santiago Network, that is also a constituted body under the convention. So, apart from this Warsaw International Mechanism, we can look at now the fund. Fund is completely different institutional location. WIM is under convention, now also under Paris Agreement. At the same time, the Los Angeles Fund is established under the convention and the Paris Agreement, not under the WIM. We need to understand it clearly. So now WIM also a fund. There are two institutions are there to deliver the needs of the vulnerable communities and the ecosystems. Now, for example, tools developed by the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, those tools can be facilitate, activate at the national level by the Santiago Network through their technical assistance, also capacity building assistance. Then, if you look at the national contact point, that is also under the Convention on the Paris Agreement. So, contact point at the national level, they can collaborate with the Santiago Network to identify right body or an expert to help government to assess the needs, to assess the nature, to identify the approaches, to identify the required institutions, to identify the required legal framework. So this technical body really could help national governments. Then national government needs money for this technical assistance providing agency. They also need money. So we need to access the fund and funding arrangement. So now in terms of the fund and funding arrangement, we agreed with very innovative ideas, I would say. If you look at the governing instrument and adoption decision, all there are some beautiful provisions. I'm pretty sure Dan will focus on that provisions in detail. But just I would highlight just two issues. We agreed for trigger-based approach, which is very interesting and needs to be innovative. You also talked about that during an incident, the vulnerable communities needs to be supported in cash. Then what would the channel to provide them cash during the crisis? Secondly, we agreed for programmatic approach. Particularly for slow onset processes, we need to take, of course, long-term, short-term, mid-term programs, not project-based. Those programs can be developed at the national level with support from Santiago Network. So once we can develop a long program, then we can submit to the fund. So fund then can approach those programs and they can provide direct budget support. So this is how the very complex, I would say, loss and damage global policy regime. You see, there are so many institutions, but I would say it's very structured, organized. Now the challenge is to ensure the coherence, coordination, and the synergies among these different institutions under the Convention on the Paris Agreement. That is the challenge. And colleagues are very happy to let you know that EXCOM, I'm the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, is going to organize a side event during the COP, focusing on particularly on this coherence, coordination, synergies among these institutions. So it's a challenge now, and at COP29, we are going to review this Warsaw International Mechanism. So that would be an opportunity how to overcome the existing coordination gaps and how can we promote this the coordination among all these institutions. So with that expectation, we all are moving towards the COP29. Some of you, I think I'll meet in person at COP29. Shivanis, with that said, I would like to stop here because other speakers are really important to tell their experiences. I would like to thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Hafiz. And we are looking forward to the side event of the WIMEXCOM at the COP. And this is a great slide because this also presents where the next speakers are currently based. So next up, we will hear from Christopher Bartlett, who is from Vanuatu, but he will be speaking about Vanuatu experiment experience on the application for technical assistance from the Santiago network, as you can see here, which is the technical arm of the governance structure. And then we have the next speaker, Daniel Lund, who will be representing the financial arm, which is the fund for loss and damage. So thanks, Hafiz. And let me just move on briefly to the next speaker, who, if you have been dealing with following the negotiations on loss and damage, the next speaker should be well known to everyone. Christopher Bartlett is currently based in Vanuatu, and he is the Vanuatu Head of Climate Strategy and Thematic Lead on Loss and Damage. The first time I heard about Christopher, someone told me that he is a superstar negotiator at COPS, and I'm pretty sure that all the fellow speakers would agree. Christopher, it's nice to have you here. Floor is yours. I'll stop sharing my screen and you can share your slides.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be speaking in this event, particularly because GGGI right now is doing so much on the cutting edge of loss and damage. And it's been a real pleasure that you've been beside us in Vanuatu as we explore this really novel space in the UNFCCC regime. So I'll be talking about the Santiago network, but it's very much linked to what Hafiz just explained about the governance and particularly the executive committee, as well as what Dan will soon talk about, the fund, the new fund. So I think Vanuatu has, for a long time, been right at the forefront of discussions about loss and damage and negotiating for acknowledgement of loss and damage within the regime, because we are so affected. So when you think about Vanuatu, an island chain in the South Pacific, you probably think about the pictures here, beautiful landscapes and healthy coral reefs and wonderful people, and all of that is true. But what is also true about Vanuatu is that we are experiencing every possible impact of this climate crisis, which all of which are leading to now, in some cases, existential loss and damage. I mean, our communities, of course, are experiencing increasing severity of tropical cyclones, which is devastating island communities. We've got floods and droughts and ocean acidification and coral bleaching, landslides. I mean, it is truly an onslaught of cascading and compounding climate disasters. And that is why I think you've been hearing so much from Vanuatu from the very beginning. So way back in 1991, this is even before the UNFCCC had become a treaty, Vanuatu proposed that there should have been an international climate fund to finance the kinds of measures that would address those adverse impacts of climate change. And we even proposed an insurance mechanism, an insurance pool to help small island states deal with sea level rise. I just want to check, are you able to see the slide advance? Is that okay?
Yes, we are able to see, but it's still on the first page. Yeah.
Okay, in that case, I'm just going to go ahead. So I'm just going to show you the slides in this format. I hope you can see now.
Yes.
So Vanuatu, yes. So Vanuatu has been at the forefront for a long time. And then, although those proposals back in the 1990s weren't taken up, Vanuatu has continued the advocacy right through the establishment of the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism that we heard about. This is back in 2012, 2013. And continuing on, we were a part of the negotiations back at COP25 when we had the first review of the WIM. And as you would recall, it wasn't a very happy review because we saw the WIM effectively as doing nothing. in our countries, in developing countries, and particularly nothing in small island developing states like Vanuatu. What we were hearing about were these executive committee meetings. They had these expert groups that were talking and maybe producing a few reports, but nothing was happening on the ground. And so we demanded back then that there must be a technical arm of this mechanism, and thereby the Santiago Network for Technical Assistance on Loss and Damage was born out of that review. And we've, of course, carried on. In 2023, you may have heard about Vanuatu took, for the first time ever, a case on climate change to the UN's highest court, which is the International Court of Justice. And that case is ongoing right now, but it's practically a loss and damage case, because what we're asking the court to do is to tell us what are the consequences when states, this is a party process, when states fail to protect human rights and thus loss and damage or climate impacts occur. We also, during the NDC process, we also incorporated loss and damage completely. While most countries were focused on mitigation, for Vanuatu, that's just simply not the priority. We contribute almost nothing to greenhouse gases. So our NDC is almost entirely about adaptation. We have 116 commitments on adaptation, as well as loss and damage, where we have 12 commitments. And what we did in the NDC was explain to the world how we were going to get ready to begin to address loss and damage, put in place the systems and the policies and the processes so that we could start to address this expanding issue. And then the purpose of the talk today is to talk really about how Vanuatu began country engagement with the Santiago Network. So back when the Santiago Network was established, there was an opportunity for countries to put in requests on an interim basis before even there was an advisory board, before there was even a secretariat or hosts. Vanuatu made this request, and we said, we really need technical assistance to get us going on this pathway of readiness. And so our request was submitted last year in September, and we asked for 4 areas of technical assistance, and that's what the Santiago Network does. It catalyzes technical assistance through organizations or bodies or networks or experts who can respond to a very specific need of a developing country. And so our specific needs we outlined as first, undertaking a visioning exercise. We needed to essentially be able to define loss and damage in a way that was meaningful and relevant for Vanuatu. While there's a lot of talk at the global level, at the international level, what does it actually mean in a very specific island or multi-island context? The second activity was around capacity gaps. We found that while climate change is now an essential part of everyone's job description, in every ministry at every level in climate change, loss and damage was not quite well understood. We certainly address cyclone impacts and we're dealing with sea level rise, but how does loss and damage fit in the context of adaptation and with humanitarian action? It wasn't clear. So this part of the technical assistance is to help us really define what we mean locally. The third part of the technical assistance request is around knowledge brokering. So while we use the phrase loss and damage, and we kind of sort of understand what that means at the international level, it absolutely has to be reinterpreted and reconveyed, brokered to the different stakeholders here in Vanuatu. So there's technical assistance to how that is communicated to chiefs and traditional authorities, to subnational governments, to private sector, to civil society, and of course, even to our MPs and decision makers, how they understand loss and damage. So that brokering. But the most important part of this technical assistance request was actually anticipating the new finance for loss and damage that we know will soon be flowing from the fund that Dan will talk about shortly. And we asked for support to develop essentially a proposal for the new fund. So we know that there are around 700 million US dollars committed to the fund at the moment. We expect that there's going to be a lot more. So how could Vanuatu already, before there's even a funding application, how could we start to put together a funding proposal? Now, our idea for this proposal would be to develop a Vanuatu loss and damage country program. So we did not want to have a loss and damage project. We have gone through that process where you develop a short-term project, an implementing entity or an executing entity does it on behalf of government, you get accredited, it goes through this whole process and painful back and forth between the funds and the government, and then the project essentially ends in 2 years. And it's just not the way that we need to address these long-term, evolving, cross-sectoral projects. And so we want a program. And the idea from the program is that it would pull funds not just from the fund, but also from the wider funding arrangements, the architecture that's out there. How could our country program bring in resources from the World Bank, from the GCF, from bilateral and official development assistance? So it would really be a comprehensive national initiative over the long term. And so we were very clear about what this proposal will be. First of all, it has to be long term, not project cycle. It needs to be able to address the whole range of loss and damage impacts, whether they're slow onset, rapid response, extreme event, be able to look at different types of activities. So it wouldn't just be doing one thing, but things that are essentially necessary for all types of stakeholder and needed by all types of stakeholders. We would be looking horizontally across sectors as well as vertically across the different levels, from community-based right up to the largest infrastructure. We would be looking at having a direct access window in our own national program so that communities could directly access resources without going through any kind of intermediaries, or at least using intermediaries that are local and trusted. And of course, it would build on our own experiences over the last decade in dealing with loss and damage. And some of those experiences that we expect to put in our country program with technical assistance would be doing assessments that would capture some of the non-economic losses and damages. So after a cyclone, we have post-disaster needs assessments, but what about biodiversity? That's almost not captured in the current regime of monitoring impacts. We were also hoping to make sure that our country program was firmly based in human rights approaches. And so we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years, linking very specific impacts to specific human rights as articulated in our human rights conventions. We also expect that our country program, our loss and damage country program, would have a very human-focused element, making sure that people on the ground who are experiencing and addressing loss and damage impacts get the resources they need. So for example, in Vanuatu, we have trialed a cash transfer and voucher program so that money is placed directly in the hands of those who will be responding to the impacts. And so this would be a part and parcel of the national country program. And of course, there are other systems like insurance systems. And so we expect that our country program with the TA from the Santiago network would incorporate microinsurance for farmers and fishers so that, after an event, they would get the small money that's required to build back their livelihoods. What we know is also coming is that we have a fund, a national fund. So this would be essentially a national trust fund, which will provide resources to a whole range of individuals. And we expect that the international fund would be able to provide resources to our national fund. So this would essentially be the channel, and then the national fund could disperse them through various financing modalities that I mentioned before. Also in the works, and very much thanks to GGI for this, we are developing one of the first ever national loss and damage policy frameworks. And the idea here is that we articulate very clearly and using our own systems and structures what a loss and damage country program would look like, how we pull in different financing mechanisms, how we address slow onset and non-economic losses and damages, and of course, defining loss and damage in our own way. And that should be done by the end of this year. And I think it really is going to be kind of a standard setting policy for other countries around the world to use as a model. I also wanted to let you know that in our...
If you can kindly wrap up soon.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I will do. Sorry about that. I just want to let you know that in our request to Santiago Network, we've been very specific that we want to use local expertise. So we want to make sure that the technical assistance isn't fly in, fly out from the global north, but very much based on our own needs. And with that, I will close. We have a whole range of activities and ideas, and I'd love if you wanted to reach out to Vanuatu. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Christopher, for the great presentation and sharing your experience in Vanuatu. I do hope that more countries will follow in submitting technical assistance to the Santiago network, as well as incorporating LND in NDC, for example. Thanks. So now I would like to move on to the next speaker. Let me then share my screen again. So our next speaker is Daniel Lund, currently based in Fiji. And Daniel is a board member to the fund corresponding to loss and damage. So that's the official name of the new fund. And Daniel has been also a member of the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage and represents small island developing states as part of the newly established fund. Daniel, great to have you here. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and really appreciate the opportunity to come after Chris and Hafish, who I have worked closely with on the board and within this broader arrangement of loss and damage modalities and mechanisms and arrangements. And I think proof of concept is there are a lot of crossovers between the different arrangements that are in place, and it's the sort of coordination between people and those entities that continues to be really important for ensuring that this architecture over time becomes really effective in its mandate. Just to zoom back out, and Chris has enabled us to really look down at the national level, and that's really where we should be looking up from, ensuring that things are built from the bottom up and responsive, and that's very much where the fund really needs to play a role. And so just looking at the recent history, much of this has been discussed by previous speakers, but really there's been a real uptick in the activity around the international response to loss and damage since COP25. But as has been mentioned, really the call for a more mature and direct response to loss and damage has been ongoing for over 30 years. So at COP27, there was the breakthrough, this decision to establish a fund and funding arrangements for loss and damage, and this was no easy feat to get to this stage, and really was in part defined by the kind of the evolution of the discussions from COP25 and COP26, where there was this need to ensure that there is actually a financial opportunity to directly address loss and damage and build upon the knowledge and the technical expertise and that is derived from the policy arm of the Warsaw International Mechanism. So with that decision at COP27, the real sort of initial blueprint of the political intention was in place, but the defining kind of structure of what this fund and funding arrangements meant and looked like required a design process in the form of a transitional committee, which was established to develop recommendations, which at COP28 were accepted and endorsed by all parties in the opening session, and became essentially the governing instrument of this fund. And with the establishment of the board following COP28, there is now the processes that the board is managing to really stand up the institutional arrangements, the policies, the design, to explain really how the fund will deliver against its fairly substantial and hopefully innovative mandate to support the deployment of finance that's directly for addressing loss and damage. So next slide, please. And I think throughout all these discussions, the political dimensions continue to be important, and this really speaks to the way in which these issues need to be navigated when it comes to the board, and also negotiations within the COP, and also the general articulation of where loss and damage sits within the array of needs and requirements and agenda points within international negotiations. Some of these negotiations have really been the crux of how we've been able to establish this fund, but will continue to be challenges that parties need to address in the lead up to COP29 and during the negotiations at COP29. Firstly, there's this issue of whether the Paris Agreement has and the convention has a specific mandate to support countries to address loss and damage. I think from majority of countries' views, of course it does. Essentially, there would be no need for a Paris Agreement if there wasn't the understanding that climate change causes loss and damage, that there's a need to avert, minimize, and be able to address it. And of course, within the Paris Agreement, there is recognition of loss and damage within Article 8. And though the financial instrument is focused on specific wording around mitigation and adaptation, it's very clear that understood within those parameters is the need to also be able to address the ultimate impacts of climate change. Many of the challenges that the fund faces and continues to face is really around who pays. How does the fund become resourced? Can it receive innovative financing from taxes and levies? Are the traditional developing country recipients still the same recipients that are to be targeted? And these are all very political issues and challenges for the fund, as well as looking at concepts of eligibility, understanding ways of sort of justifying needs and vulnerability, and thinking about how financing to loss and damage can be articulated in its relationship with adaptation. I think it's very important to recognize that in addition to the fact that there are impacts of climate change that are unavoidable in many cases, there are climate change impacts that were avoidable but have become unavoidable due to the slow deployment of adaptation solutions. And if we look at the way that financing has flowed to date, current research and estimates suggest that countries have been receiving an 18th of the financing required to actually affect meaningful adaptation solutions. So these sort of deficits and structural issues in the financial architecture have really exacerbated the need for a fund. And in this way, there's a lot of pressure for this fund to be able to deliver solutions that are differentiated. The fund needs to be different. It needs to operate in a way that is beyond the scope of projects. It needs to be responsive as well as sensitized to national circumstances and needs. And all of these requirements actually set us up for a fund that has to be different in many ways and requires a sort of an innovative approach and a political desire to really change the way finance flows to the most vulnerable. Many challenges around looking at how the finance will be understood, how financing needs will be articulated, and this is where the concepts of ensuring that there's a nationally owned, nationally led approach that Chris had covered is so important. So beyond these negotiation issues, there is now a fund that has a mandate that really has within it the potential to deliver something different. Next slide, please. So if we look closely at the governing instrument of the fund, really the purpose is to ensure that those most vulnerable to climate change and are experiencing economic and non-economic loss and damage are able to be assisted and supported by the fund. The fund is required to operate in a manner that is coherent and complementary to the other arrangements that Hafish had mentioned. And there's really a need to look at how the fund strategically enters the financing space. We know that there are various funding arrangements available that are targeting a very specific period following a disaster event, and arguably some insurance instruments and different arrangements that happen just after a disaster fall into that space of addressing loss and damage. In many cases, it's more about minimizing, but there is recognition that there's a need to rapidly deploy financing. However, there is also a real requirement to recognize that the real gap that exists is the gap that goes beyond that initial disaster response and is outside necessarily of a distinction between slow and sudden onset events. And this is really the residual losses, the irreversible losses that occur as a result of both slow and onset and sudden onset events. And as various factors in society change and adjust to deal with climate change, there are further effects that create loss and damage. So loss and damage, really, in its realization on the ground and in its local manifestations, is often difficult to disaggregate or differentiate between slow onset and sudden onset. Because really these impacts are cumulative, they are compounding, they're interrelated, and often countries and communities are both responding, recovering, and preparing for disasters all at the same time. So that linear relationship between, in the disaster risk management cycle, in many cases is becoming less valuable as a concept, but certainly one that continues to influence the way we think about risk management. So very importantly within this is the approach that the fund will take, and this element of the governing instrument is really key, and something that many developing countries, especially the Pacific and SIDS, have pushed for, and that's for greater country ownership, and beyond that, actually looking at direct access for resources and understanding really the overall challenges that countries have experienced as a result of the majority of climate finance being accessed outside and flowing through external systems. So if you could just go to the next slide.
If you can, 1 minute, it'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. So really just a couple of points on direct access, as I think this is a key concept for thinking about what the fund needs to do. So really to be able to deliver the country-led approaches that Chris had well articulated, it's really about the mechanism the fund puts in place, and at the heart of the governing instrument is a recognition of direct access and the need for funds to be able to go straight into the hands of those that are in need, but also to allow countries and government actors, civil society, people at the national level, to be able to define and shape these responses, because the context in which loss and damage is experienced is all defining when it comes to the way loss and damage is manifested. So that sensitivity and need for it to be nationally driven is really key, and this is a key element of how the operational modalities of the fund need to be designed. There's also the efficiency element, where the majority of climate finance requiring the use of intermediaries leads to a situation where the actual finance that arrives on the ground is highly eroded. In some cases, up to 35% lost in the sort of overheads of running climate change projects. So the programmatic approach really puts in place the need to build systems that can evolve and be sensitized and reactive, responsive to the needs on the ground. And so these programmatic approaches that Chris had spoken to really are what the fund needs to be able to understand and develop a means to interact with. And this is a really part of the active work of the board to do so. And being able to involve that range of actors in this space and not have funding essentially channeled through very specific known actors and international actors really is where we start to look at that real mainstreaming of both climate risk and also the ability to address loss and damage within the operations of the fund and the broader responses. So I'll leave it there given time, but thanks very much.
Thanks, Daniel, for providing insights of the newly established fund. We'll move on straight to the last speaker, so they will have some time for Q&A. Our last speaker is Natalie Andre, who is the technical lead for adaptation in the Pacific in GGGI. And Natalie will be sharing the project that she's working on in Tonga on the finance risk assessment. Natalie, you can share your screen.
Thank you, Shivanes. So I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. I'm very happy to have been able to support and work alongside both Dr. Chris for Vanuatu, supporting on the development of the new fund, but also picking Dan's brains also for our work through the SIDS cap on loss and damage. I'm going to focus more on national financing vehicles. So this is essentially some of the work that's come out from Tonga. It's just been validated. It was validated yesterday, so really fresh off the press. and led by the GGI team in Tonga, Lana Fonua, but also with the excellent consultant Vivian Yu. So this work, I'm just going to give a little bit of context. There's a program that's funded by the UK FCDO, and it's focusing on climate finance access and absorption, with advisors embedded in 7 countries, mainly in the climate finance ministries, and some in the climate change divisions. So we're really looking at unblocking the issues for long-term solutions for climate finance, and most of the advisors are working supporting on national financing vehicles. So in the case of Vanuatu, Rebecca is supporting on the loss and damage financing vehicle for Vanuatu, but others in Tonga, for instance, there's a finance vehicle that's already developed, but we want to help operationalize it with the view that this could also become a loss and damage vehicle in the longer term. So the thinking for Tonga is really, there are already several policies and strategies in place, the Climate Change Act being a key one. To be able to implement that, there is a need for a certain amount of policies, and one of them, which we have been working on more recently, is on the risk assessment framework. So this risk assessment framework is also a requirement from the GCF, and it will also be a requirement for the national financing vehicle in Tonga, so the Climate Change Trust. So a lot of these kind of building blocks that we're building have various applicability, and I think Dr. Chris mentioned, the programmatic approach that's being put forward does require also looking at things holistically and having a vehicle that can maybe address several issues, of which loss and damage. The important thing is also that they're at national level as well. So risk management, and this is really the experts' summary. So we're looking at the risk of impact of uncertainty, and there's a whole science to it. And this is not about looking at what risk is and how it's assessed, but I just want to take through a little bit some of the key steps that were taken, and some of the key outcomes that are really applicable for these national financing vehicles, and where the definition of loss and damage, especially in the local context, will need to be incorporated. So we're looking at the risk of impact, the uncertainty, and just also in terms of management, what is the appetite, and how are we going to monitor and report on this. So there are different lines of defense, and the first ones are in terms of policy, which these regulations are already put in place, so that's great. The second line of defense is what we've been looking at. So we've been looking at a comprehensive risk assessment and risk mapping. So initially there were 140 risks identified for Tonga, for the Ministry of Finance. These were gone through with a fine-tooth comb and narrowed down to 110. And what was interesting was then to group them and look at a way forward. And then the third line of defense was really carrying out an audit program and making sure that this assessment is done regularly, and also that it's unbiased. So an audit, and there needs to be a process where these risks were also checked by a third party. So there are several types of risks, and I think maybe not too interesting to go through the detail on all of them, but the study basically went through the different types of risks, and then assigned values onto their likelihood and their importance. And so this is also the way that would loss and damage would also be looking at identifying what these risks are for loss and damage, and then assigning, I'm sorry, I can't see the title, but assigning how, the consequence of these. So do these have a severe or minor consequence? And that also has a weighting. Okay, I'm struggling with my way forward. So the summary here just shows a little bit kind of the extent of the risks that were assessed. Initially, as I mentioned, there were 140. These were whittled down to 110, and they were grouped so as to be able to look at them a little bit holistically and look at a way forward. Maybe also a point of interest is that previously when a risk assessment had been carried out, and I think it was done by PwC, a lot of them were in the higher extreme. The actual assessment of risk was kind of revised to look at something, what is risk, what is high and extreme, and that was reduced by quite a bit to these numbers here. So what was interesting is also that there's now a plan on how to address these risks. 15 top risks were identified, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think what we can say is, in general, the top risks were in human resources and IT. The policies also, the repository of all policies is not super clear. I think it's something that many of the Pacific countries can relate to as well, just to track the essential policies. The IT, because the data is key for MOF, this is something that they're going to look at improving. So these are actual practical points that they're going to work on, which seems a little far off from loss and damage, but these are basics for MOF to be functioning. And without it, we're not giving donors the confidence. The MOF can actually operate in different risks themselves, and be able to handle the funds themselves. And then the last one, which is probably quite impactful, is the human resources. So there's a high vacancy rate, around 25% of positions are vacant. There's a series of other data in terms of turnover, in terms of how many of those staff are actually project staff. And so these kind of culminate in risks, which ultimately has an impact when we're designing these national financing vehicles, that the donors look, and if there's a plan to address it, there's more chance for funds, sovereign funds to be placed in these national financing vehicles, and for the countries to have sovereignty over those. So I'm just going to wrap up. I think there's 16 different measures that have been developed with the agreement of MOF addressing these the risks, and I'll be happy to share it and release it once it's nicely laid out, but that's coming soon. So I'm going to stop there and thank Vivienne, who's in the picture, who carried out a bulk of the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie, for presenting the project in Tonga. We actually plan a big chunk of Q&A session, but considering the time, I guess we only have time for one question. And I would like to turn to Daniel and ask the million-dollar question. Daniel, what is the timeline and process for countries to access the financial resources from the Loss and Damage Fund? So when can countries expect to actually able to access the fund? and what steps should countries take now to ensure that they are ready to apply once the funds become available and accessible?
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, firstly, I think in the overall sort of history of international funds, the setup of funds obviously has always taken time, and it's clear that despite the fairly rapid progress of the loss of the fund for responding to loss and damage, that there is still a significant legwork that needs to be done to design the long-term policies and approach that the fund will take. That being said, and I think in many ways it is very important for there to be a pretty significant focus on designing these modalities correctly at this stage. Even if there is a delay by a year or so, this fund is here for a long time and is meant to be part of the international response into the future. So design remains really important, and getting it right the first time, or as well as we can orient it is important, but also noting that the fund will evolve with time. But saying that the board will deliberate at the upcoming fourth meeting of the board following COP29 on options for early interventions by the fund. And really this is looking at how the fund could disperse resources quickly over the next 2 years to develop proof of concept, to show the different approach that the fund wants to take, noting that the way that these funds would be dispersed may need to draw upon sort of quick wins and existing mechanisms, potentially at the national level, hopefully at the national level, that could deliver the types of results that are within the fund's mandate. So with that being said, yeah, there is a need to sort of recognize that the Santiago network is there to help support some of the readiness to access the fund, and that there is work and policy development that has to happen at many national in many national contexts. But there is also an opportunity for the fund to disperse and being prepared and thinking about what some of those channels for funding could be would be important in this immediate term, with the potential for funds to be accessed in the next year or two. And I think really part of this would be thinking about what systems exist at a national level. Are there initiatives by civil society that can be supported, that can help develop proof of concept for how national responses to loss and damage can be defined? Are there disaster response funds that can be retrofitted to include a kind of cordoned off section of the fund that can be reserved for finance for loss and damage? Are there social protection schemes that already exist that can be adapted to include cash transfer for loss and damage affected communities? These are the types of questions and areas where national stakeholders have the opportunity to now think about what they could do in the short term, while also thinking about that longer term evolution of national programs. I think really it's about incentivizing that thinking is really important part of what the fund can do. Because if there's knowledge that there is funding that can actually address loss and damage and can be utilized through national systems, there is then an incentive to actually build those systems. Whereas currently there are systems that exist that really, there's empty disaster trust funds all over the world. There are a deficit of social protection schemes throughout majority of developing countries. And with a fund that can actually interact with those systems, there is hopefully greater incentive to design them and in so doing build resilience in countries, because by addressing loss and damage, it opens up and frees up the resources needed to be able to continue to invest in longer term resilience and adaptation. And I think really that's one of the relationships that really needs to be understood, that addressing loss and damage is not the end point. Often being able to address loss and damage through additional access to funding means that you're not diverting funds away from sustainable development, longer term resilience building and adaptation. So filling that gap is really critical for longer term ability to actually reduce exposure to loss and damage. And so hopefully thinking about national systems and mechanisms in the short term, thinking about small grant schemes, these types of opportunities are where potentially early interventions from the fund could be accessed and supported.
Thanks, Dan. We need to close the session now. Thank you again for all the speakers for joining and those who attended this session. Thank you.
Thank you.